we're going to make a garment that has a raglan sleeve. So we're going to put a raglan sleeve into the bodice of the garment. So a raglan sleeve is known by its diagonal seam that sews the sleeve to the bodice, and that diagonal seam runs from the underarm to the neckline. So this sleeve is used a lot in athletic wear or leisure wear because with the diagonal seam, what actually has occurred is the top part around the neck, that part of the bodice has actually become part of the sleeve. This sleeve allows for good movement from the front to back of the arm, which is a movement we see a lot of times as we are participating in sports or in leisure activities. To make the raglan sleeve, you're going to need raglan bodice front, number 23, raglan bodice back, number 24. You're going to need the raglan sleeve back, 26, raglan sleeve front, 25. Those are all out of our green pattern pieces. To sew the raglan sleeve, we're going to sew the raglan sleeve front to the bodice front at the shoulder, or where the sleeve connects to the bodice. We're going to sew the sleeve back to the bodice back. So we'll start with the front. We're going to open our front up. These are on the fold, and we're going to lay our bodice front right side up. Then we're going to take our raglan sleeve and we are going to line up the seam matching our notches with right sides together. Okay. It's very important that you match your notches because at your neck, your sleeve and your bodice are not going to line up. They're not going to match at the edges. Okay, your bodice is going to be slightly longer than your sleeve itself, and it should be the distance of your seam allowance, which is 1/4 of an inch. So we'll go ahead and line up the edges in our notches, and we'll pin that. And we'll do that for both sides. And we know that we've applied the front sleeve to the bodice front because we're lining up single notches. Okay? Then we'll do the same thing for the bodice back. So open your bodice back up. It should be cut on the fold also. And we're going to lay that right side up. And we're going to pin the sleeve to our bodice, matching our notches in the edge of our fabrics where the sleeve and the bodice attach. We're going to do that for both sides of the bodice. We're going to sew the sleeve to the bodice. We're going to start with the bodice front. We're going to do a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So we're going to line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the presser foot. We're going to use a regular stitch length and we're going to back stitch. And we're going to sew along the sleeve edge. to the neckline. When we get to the neckline, we'll back stitch. And then we will do the same thing for the other side, or the other sleeve on the bodice front. So again, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch. Get to the edge, back stitch. We will do the same thing for the back. Now we'll stitch the sleeve to the bodice back, so 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so line the fabric edge up with the edge of the presser foot, back stitch, sew along the sleeve seam, and we get to the edge, back stitch, and we'll do the other sleeve on the bodice back, back stitch, and we'll get to the edge, back stitch, we've sewn our sleeve to our bodice, to the bodice front and the bodice back. Now we need to press those seams open and flat. So we'll do that to the seams, to the sleeves on the bodice front. And we'll do those to the seams on the bodice back. We have our sleeve sewn to our bodice. Now we're ready to sew the front to the back to sew our garment together. So what we're going to do is we are going to lay our garment front on the table, right sides up. We're going to lay our garment back down, right side down, on top of our garment front. And we are going to sew across the top of the sleeve to sew those closed. Some of your raglan sleeves will have a seam across the top of the sleeve, others may not. So if you have your sleeve in one piece, you would not have to do this step. So we're going to match up our notches, we're going to match up at our neckline and at our wrist. We're going to line up the edges of the fabric so that they meet, and we're going to pin that. We're going to do that for both sleeves. We're going to sew the top of our sleeve or our shoulder seam, sewing the back and fronts of our sleeves together. We're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, sew edge of the fabric lined up with the edge of the presser foot, regular stitch length. We're going to back stitch, and then we're going to sew across the shoulder seam, which is the top of the sleeve. When we get to the edge, we're going to back stitch. Then we'll do the same thing for the other sleeve. Back stitch. Sew along the length of the top of the sleeve. When we get to the edge, back stitch. With the top of the sleeve sewn, we're now ready to finish the raglan sleeve. And to do that, we are going to sew the underarm seam and the side seam in one seam. So we're going to match up our seams where we sewed our sleeve to our bodice at the front and the back, matching up the edge of the fabric. And then we're going to match the end, so the wrist of our sleeve. And then we'll pin along our underarm sleeve, matching up the edges. Then we'll match the bottom at the waist, and we'll pin the side seam matching up the edges of the fabric. And then we will do that for the other sleeve as well. To sew the sleeve underarm seam and the bodice side seam, we're going to sew that in one seam. We're going to use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the presser foot. We use a regular stitch length. We're going to back stitch, and then we're going to stitch along the seam. I've started with the sleeve, so I'm stitching the underarm seam. I want to make sure that when I get to the seam where I've sewed my sleeve to my bodice, that is laying flat for both the back and the front. We're going to slightly turn the fabric to sew around the curve shape. We're going to continue down the side seam of the bodice. When we get to the end, we'll back stitch. We'll do the same thing for the other sleeve. So 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch, sew down. I'm starting with the sleeve, so I'm sewing the underarm of the sleeve. When I get to where the sleeve attaches to the bodice, make sure my seams are flat, slightly turning the fabric to sew around the curve, and then sewing down the side seam of the bodice. When I get to the bottom, I'm going to backstitch. So we've sewn the underarm seam and the side seam, which sews our sleeve into our garment. Now, so we have this curve as we're coming from the sleeve to the bodice, and the actual shape of the fabric within the seam allowance is actually a smaller curve than the actual garment itself. So to allow for the sleeve and the bodice to be able to move and allow movement for the arm, we're going to actually clip that seam allowance. And what we're doing is we're actually just coming in and making small slits in the seam allowance, being careful to cut up to the seam but not through. And we're just going to do that around the curved section of the sleeve. We're going to do that for both of our sleeves, or both sides of our garment. And what that's going to allow to do is now that seam can spread out, because we've given that seam allowance a little freedom to be able to spread by clipping the seam allowance. So now we can turn our bodice right side out. And we have our bodice with our raglan sleeve.